Hey, I've got a question for you. Have you already been in this situation? Many adult gamers, I include myself in, say that modern video games are easier than the classic retro games we played when we were younger. Some feel that the joy of overcoming the odds and finally completing a difficult level is a thing of the past. Are developers becoming lazy with simplistic game designs, or are there other factors? If you're old enough to have played games in the 80s or early 90s, you will remember that they were hard, really damn hard. Why they were so insanely difficult? Did it happen to you that the difficulty was so high that you found yourself kicking arcade cabinets? Throwing down controllers and swearing off games in fits of rage?
What I would fucking love to do with this monitor. What I would fucking love to do. Oh!
To understand why and discover the answer, we need to have a look at the history of video games and how they were made at the time. Oh, and before I forget, please do all that stuff, it will make my day. An interesting thing when people talk about how hard old video games were, they often use the phrase Nintendo hard. Even if Nintendo wasn't the only company making early video game consoles, and definitely not the first in the market, the enormous popularity of the Nintendo Entertainment System and the near ubiquity of it in the 80s meant that nearly everyone had experience with the NES and with the inherent difficulty of early video games. So let's have a look at some of the reasons that could explain why retro games were more difficult than modern video games. You know you timed that jump right, and you know that that wasn't really in the way. But according to the game, you just slammed into the bat and missed the ledge you were aiming for. Sure, more than a few of those missed jumps over the years were simply bad timing and coordination on part of the player. But early video games suffered quite a bit from the limitations of their hardware. Early controller design was on the clunky side, compounding there were hardware limitations and the hitbox system in games. The hitbox is the area that constitutes the body of an object or enemy on the screen. And what you saw as the outline of the bad guy didn't always mesh perfectly with the hitbox as understood by the game's software. As a result, you could swear up and down that you actually shot the guy, or that he missed and didn't touch you. The game would beg to differ. Speaking of hitboxes, do you remember the agony of single-hit death? In early arcade games and console games alike, life meters were few and far between. One hit was often all it took to instantly kill you and pull up the start game over screen. Even in games where you had rudimentary health, perhaps a meager free hearts, there was always the specter of the one-hit wonder bad guy that would smash your entire life meter to bits if he detected you nearby. The only thing worse than video game death is the pain of replaying everything all over again. In early games with no save progress, no checkpoints to be seen, and no way to return to the point of last play, the only solution was to either marathon your way through the entire game in one sitting, or hope if you turned off the TV that your parents or roommates wouldn't notice the light of the Nintendo and thoughtfully turn it off. Life before game saves was a brutal wasteland of eye strain, sweaty palms, and devoting entire saves to getting to the end of a game. In games where you didn't get sent all the way back to the title screen upon death, you were often punted back to the beginning of the level. A particularly sinister version of this mechanism found in some games would kick you back to the start of the level you died on, but without your gear. Frankly, that's worse than no save progress, because at least if you get sent all the way back to the beginning of the game, you have a chance to earn power-ups and build up your character's arsenal. Dying on dungeon level 9000 and being reborn with level 1 gear is just cruel. Many modern video games have difficulty settings that let you tailor the gameplay to both your skill level and tastes. You want it super insane with enemies that are 3 times harder than usual. No problem, flip it to hell mode and blast away. You want it super chill so you can spend all the time in the world smelling the retro Skyrim flowers you added in with yet another pretty graphics mod. No problem there either. Set it to the easiest level of difficulty and focus on the stuff that really matters, like hyper-realistic butterflies. Back in the day, difficulty settings were unheard of. The game was the game. be it hard or easy, and that was that. Video games served as a sort of nerd endurance test, and if it was too hard, too frustrating, or even outright insane, then you just weren't cut out for the game, and maybe it was time for you to shuffle over to the skee-ball machine and leave the brutality of the game to those that could handle the abuse the arcade cabinet dished out. Early games had an evil architecture, spikes, bottomless pits, swinging axes, fire-spitting statues, name something that slices, dices, or smashes, and it has likely already been seen in an early video game. What early video games lacked in deep storylines and flashy graphics, they certainly made up for in creative ways to wreck your face. And here came the beat frustration when the screen was packed with guys chucking axes at you, bats swooping at your head, and snakes crawling down the walls. It's more than the patience of even the most dedicated gamer can handle sometimes. Early video games were suffering from a lack of direction. Some retro games didn't directly tell players where to go or give hints for the next steps to take. Players often got lost with no obvious way forward. The best example of this flawed approach is The Legend of Zelda. Which provides ambiguous hints which lead to total confusion. Most gamers needed a guide to discover that the final dungeon was hidden inside a random hill accessible only with a bomb because the game didn't make it clear enough. Most modern games give clear and direct instructions for your next mission, or at least provide detailed hints. Players usually have a clear understanding of the current objective, even if they need to stop to put together the hints that the game is giving. Modern games handle this in different ways but show that they have learned from the mistakes made in the past. For example, Final Fantasy games typically hold players' hands to the end, while The Legend of Zelda, The Breath of the Wild, encourages exploration and discovery. Despite both taking different approaches, they ensure that the experience isn't one filled with frustration. So in the end, you're probably wondering, why the hell would somebody design a game this way? Are there any good reasons to do that? Were they crazy at the time, or stupid, or something like that? Well, actually not really, or not always. No one sets out to design a game with bad controls. That happened, in part, because controllers of the age weren't great, but mostly because designers had basically no idea what they were doing. Game design was a brand new craft, after all, and small teams were charged with making games in relatively short periods of time. Often this means details weren't obsessed over, guns fired with a delay, jumps were impossible to control, or characters fell through platforms that look like they should be solid. This is the worst kind of Nintendo hard. Games that are difficult because of bad design choices. But bad design doesn't explain away all of Nintendo hard. Much of it really was a deliberate design choice. Part of this was economics. Games were expensive, and players needed to feel like they were getting their money's worth. If players could beat the game in a single sitting, or even over the course of a month, they would feel like they were being ripped off. But storage capacity of the era was extremely limited, so designers couldn't stretch out playtime by adding hundreds of levels. The solution: make the game really hard. Using tactics like single-hit death and evil architecture, this meant gamers needed to spend hours practicing a game before they could get to the final level, and even then, they'd probably end up dying. It made beating the game special, and helped justify paying so much for the game and console. But there's another factor to consider here. Many game designers of the age learned their craft developing arcade titles, and lots of games were straight-up ports from arcade titles. Designing games for the arcade means thinking about one factor: economics. Arcade cabinets make money on a per-play basis, so the designers have an incentive to kill you off quickly and force you to spend another quarter. It's only by playing the game hundreds of times and spending hundreds of quarters that you can get to the further levels. Games didn't need to be designed this way for the Nintendo Entertainment System, but design habits die hard. Habits from building arcade games carried over, basically because that's how people knew to build games. Add all of this up and you've got a recipe for throwing your controller at the machine on a regular basis. But today is totally different. Thanks to decades of experience to build upon and developments in technology, modern games generally have higher standards than the games that came before. Developers understand how to create a playable game, adopting the accepted blueprint of their chosen genre before adding their own spin in the formula. Many Many modern game developers experienced the horror of the difficulty of retro games and have an understanding on how to design enjoyable games that provide a deliberate challenge where appropriate. Any player with a basic understanding of a game can eventually succeed in modern games. Most modern games have difficulty spikes, but they present challenges which have been designed to be overcome. For example, the Lionel is one of the strongest bosses in The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. He challenges the player's skills, but the player who understands the game and who has the right equipment can handle the challenge. It isn't an infuriating experience. Everyone knows that the challenges they will face can be overcome. Another thing that we observe in today's video game productions is the complete fusion between the game itself and its cheats. Have you ever wondered why there is so small amount of cheats in nowadays video games compared to early ones? Back in the days of old, magazines were publishing cheats and walkthroughs for games. Imagine how easy this made games. Suddenly you have infinite lives, infinite health, and you never get lost because you can't find the exit or the next objective. That's what modern games are like. They have the cheat modes activated by default, and that's why they are much easier than the old days. Developers do this because they want to avoid the main sin of gaming, a huge frustration feeling. Another thing we don't see at first sight is that the internet has played a major role in making games easier, YouTube in particular. Before we were adult gamers, we used to have to rely on word of mouth from classmates in game guides to beat levels. We did not have the internet for help passing a level, finding the next event, or defeating a boss. A game like Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, was very difficult to complete due to the lack of information and the poor design of kneeling in a corner to create a tornado. These days, gamers can now just watch a person beat the game before trying it for themselves. This takes away much of the challenge from modern games, as players can watch and copy another player's strategy to progress, but at least the help is readily available when needed. I personally prefer to beat the game on my terms and embrace the game with a fresh mindset. But yeah, many players prefer to mimic what they saw previously on Twitch, to each their own. You know, classic games are not inherently bad just because they feature some frustrating game design decisions. It's important to remember how mind-blowing these experiences were before 4K screens, and near photorealistic visuals were a thing. To some younger gamers, these retro games are ugly, infuriating messes. But to many adult gamers, they are cherished childhood memories, regardless of their difficulty, video game difficulty. And indeed, video games themselves will continue to change. New generations of gamers become game developers and use their experience of gaming to take the medium in new directions. There are certain accepted mechanics from today that we will one day look back on as being unfair, clunky, or just broken. Likewise, there are mechanics in gaming today that will continue to be used in video games decades from now. Sure thing is that kids today have no idea of the terrible difficulty all of those designs were bringing at the time. If you are a kid and you are watching this video, I would like to know what you think about all of those old games. Just tell me in the comment section below. And for the others, let me know also in the comment section below if you enjoy more nowadays games or old games.